I'd appreciate that. My name is Sadhu Nanjundaya. I work as a coordinator with the Middle East Studies program at Central Connecticut State University. And today we are privileged to speak to us on a very important issue related to Israel and Palestine, specifically also related to Gaza. And this is Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He comes to us from New York City. He has received his doctorate in political theory from Princeton University in 1988. He has taught over the years at the City University New York system and at NYU, New York University, as well as DePaul University. He has lectured on a broad range of subjects that relate to peace activism, international law, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Last year in the fall, he offered a 10-week class as part of the Brooklyn Public Library School Series on landmark documents and speeches in American history. I want to also acknowledge the support we have received for this talk by Dr. Finkelstein from International Studies at Central Connecticut State University, from the Center for International Education, and from Peace Studies, as well as from the Africana Center. They've been very generous with their contributions to make this possible. After the talk, you are please welcome to ask questions, but keep them very, very brief, because he's under a time constraint and we'll have to conclude this program just about 7:15. Please feel free to have the refreshments in the back, but also pay attention to the books, the several books that Dr. Finkelstein has written over the years that have been acknowledged, that have been translated, and that are available in 50 editions overseas as well. So I'd like to now welcome Dr. Finkelstein to Central Connecticut State University.
I was debating what topic to speak on this evening. There was a choice between speaking on a somewhat technical topic and speaking on a broader, more general topic. And I decided I would speak on the broader topic, the less technical one, and also to limit my remarks because we're living now to some extent, we're living in pretty tumultuous times, and it's an opportunity for many of you who follow developments in the news to ask me questions and for us to interact. So, the other evening I spoke at a Democratic Socialists of America, a DSA meeting, and they asked me to speak on 4 topics. Number 1, to lay out the essentials of the Israel-Palestine conflict so as to make it accessible to a broad audience. 2, to speak on what's called the special relationship between the United States and Israel. 3, to look at recent developments, of which there have been several in the past few weeks. And 4, for those of you who have an activist inclination, to speak about what can be done at the particular moment in order to try to achieve some kind of justice. And I put together some brief remarks, and it seemed to have been successful, so I will now go over the same ground, and then we'll have a chance to talk. The first question is, what are the basics of the conflict? Obviously, it's by now a long history. Most people date the modern aspect of the conflict to roughly the end of the 19th century, about the 1880s, when this movement called Zionism emerged on the political map. And so you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that a century and 4 decades have passed. And how do you sort of telescope that century and 4 decades in a manner that people can grasp? And having given the matter a certain amount of reflection, it seems to me the two essentials of trying to understand the conflict, in particular for a U.S. audience, is first of all the fact that when you look at the history of Palestinian dispossession and displacement by what began as foreign settlers and now is a state, when you look at that history of dispossession and displacement, it's not all that dissimilar, and in many ways I would say their similarities are striking between what happened to the Palestinians and what happened to the Native American population in the United States. I once, many an eon ago, I sat down, I read through the history of the Cherokee Nation, and I found in going through that history that the similarities between that history, what happened to the Cherokee, who started out on the East Coast and then were gradually pushed further and further west. They then went from Mississippi in what was called the Trail of Tears. They ended up in Arkansas, and then a tiny part of Arkansas was carved out, came to be called Oklahoma. And once the white settlers in Oklahoma exceeded in number by, I think, a ratio of 10 to 1, the indigenous Cherokee population, then Oklahoma declared its independence as a state. If you look at that process, I don't think it, obviously a similar, when you say something is analogous to or similar to, obviously there are differences, but I think the similarities are significant enough that the analogy works. The Cherokee were an interesting case because the claim was always that the native population was so unlike the European settlers that they couldn't assimilate. But the Cherokee did everything they could to assimilate. They adopted a written language. They established private property. And in fact, they became so American that they had slaves. The Cherokee, I'm not saying it in praise of them, just as a factual matter, they supported the South during the Civil War because they were slaveholders. But no matter how Americanized they became, it still didn't prevent them from facing the fate of being displaced and dispossessed. Large numbers, by that era, large numbers killed. By current era, it doesn't quite reach the numbers nowadays that get killed in these sorts of conflicts. The other factor, that's the historical factor, that I think if you want to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's no better place to begin than to look at your own history textbooks and see what happened to the native population. The other factor is what I would call the political and legal factor of the Israel-Palestine conflict. There has been established since roughly, you can say, the mid-1970s, there has existed a basic consensus in the international community about how to resolve the conflict in the language of what's called the peace process. It's called the final status issues. And the final status issues basically mean borders what should be the borders of a Palestinian state, Jerusalem, what is the legal status of Jerusalem, the settlements, what's the legal status of the settlements Israel has built in the occupied Palestinian territories, and the question of the refugees. What is to be done with the 750,000 refugees that Israel expelled in the course of its creation in 1947, and then the children, the grandchildren, probably at this point now even great-grandchildren of the refugees who were originally expelled, they too, under international law, have the status of refugees, and how to resolve what's called the refugee question. And over the past several decades, as I said, beginning roughly in the mid-1970s, which is already a half century ago, there has crystallized a consensus for resolving the conflict, that is to say, how to resolve those four issues. But sometimes others added like water, and they claim now another issue is security, but I don't agree that that was ever part of the concerns of the international community. But setting that aside, the fact of the matter is, on all of the critical issues on which there has been an international agreement over the past 50 years, Israel not only stands outside the consensus, but Israel is overtly hostile to the consensus. That is to say, it does not accept that it has to return all the territories it acquired during the June 1967 war. It does not accept that East Jerusalem is part of the Palestinian territory designated for self-determination. It does not accept that the settlements are illegal, and it does not accept that the refugees have a right of return. On the other hand, whether you look at the UN votes, the votes of the United Nations General Assembly, even if you look at most of the issues, the Security Council, if you look at the representative human rights organizations, the respected mainstream organizations, places like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, if you look at the respected humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, on all of the issues which I just mentioned, they have weighed in consistently over the past half decade in opposition to the official positions of the State of Israel. So the whole international community, if you look at the record over a very long period of time, it says that the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, are occupied Palestinian territories. It says that the settlements are illegal under international law. When I listed the representative organizations, I left out, but I should include the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. When the question of the settlements came before the ICJ in 2004, I've studied quite a lot of the history of the International Court of Justice, and it's composed of representatives from the Security Council nations and also several others. It tends to be a very contentious body with very independently minded individuals, sitting judges, sitting on the court. But when it came to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it was remarkable for the fact that when they had to rule on these issues in 2004, there was no disagreement. There is no disagreement. The settlements are illegal under international law. There were two Jews on the court at that point, Justice Bergenthal from the United States and Justice Rosalind Higgins from the UK. She was Jewish. She was married to an Irishman. They were part of the majority. The vote was 15-0 on the question of the legality of the settlements. I mention that now because it seems pretty, I think, pretty clear that within probably the next few months, the Israel government will annex what are called the major settlement blocks, about 10% of the West Bank that exists on the so-called Israeli side of the wall that Israel has built inside the West Bank. And that will be, under international law, a complete defiance and flouting of the law. It's almost certain that President Trump will approve that move. My guess is, for those of you who are into reading tea leaves and reading crystal balls, my guess is what's going to happen will be that Jared Kushner, the twit from New Jersey, will issue his peace plan. He's about as qualified to issue peace plans as I am to perform in the Bolshoi. He's a complete imbecile. The only reason he ever got anywhere in life is because of his father's money. His father is such a supreme crook that, believe me, in order to be a billionaire, as his father is, and Jewish as his father is, and to get convicted and sent to jail in New Jersey, you have to be, on the order of Attila the Hun for that to happen to you. But his father was in jail. How did Jared get to Harvard? Many of you probably know that in the past few weeks, there's been all this news coverage regarding the cheating schemes for getting into schools. And many commentators noted in the course of discussing these cheating schemes, they noticed, well, the whole admissions process has kind of always been corrupt. But I was very curious to see if anybody would mention the most corrupt example of the corrupt admissions scheme. And that, of course, is how did Jared get into Harvard? He got into Harvard because his father gave Harvard $2.4 million. And then he got in. And that's just commonplace. Just Google Jared Kushner, Harvard admission. But, our system is, the media, there are certain limits beyond which it won't go. And so out of deference to Mr. Kushner's title, they don't mention the fact that if ever there were an example of corruption in our admission system, it's him. They interviewed his teachers at this private school where he attended high school. They said he didn't qualify to get into Harvard. His grades weren't good. His test scores weren't good. Well, now the twit, the nitwit, he's hatching peace schemes. What's going to happen, I think it's pretty clear. What's going to happen is that he will present a proposal which was basically written, not basically, it was written by Netanyahu. The Palestinians will reject it, rightfully, obviously, inevitably. And then the Palestinians will be accused of not wanting peace and standing in the way of peace and being stubborn and being irrational. And then that will give the green light for the new government to annex what are called the major settlement blocks. I would also want to note, for those of you who have more than the average amount of knowledge on the topic, the whole ruling elite has supported that for the past 10 and 15 years. It's not just Trump, and it's not just Netanyahu. If you look at the statements that are put out by people like Dennis Ross, Martin Indyk, for those of you who know the names, they've all supported, they've all said, in any final resolution of the conflict, Israel will keep the settlement blocks. The settlement blocks basically mean the critical water resources in the West Bank and some of the best, the most arable land. And the Palestinians will get a garbage heap, which, given that they are inferiors, is all that they deserve. But as this process unfolds, it's worth keeping in mind that under international law, the settlements, all of them, are illegal, and that they have to be dismantled, or, it's possible people can reach some sort of agreement on what are called land swaps. It's a contentious but still a reasonable way of trying to resolve the problem. But what's clearly not reasonable is to annex the territory unilaterally, because among other things, that's just a flagrant, a blatant breach of international law. Under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, it constitutes a war crime. So it seems to me that the political and legal consensus for resolving the conflict is a feature that everybody should bear in mind, because ultimately you have to find a standard, a basis for resolving these sorts of conflicts. Now, everybody is entitled to his or her own moral standard by the beliefs of several people in the room. I'm sure they think the only just settlement is that the people who originate as foreign settlers, now the Jewish citizens of Israel, that they should have to pack up their bags and leave, go back where they came from, or to accept a unitary state in the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, in which they would be reduced to a numerical minority. And as a moral position, it's as just or as unjust as any other moral position. It's very hard to argue one person's morality versus another person's morality, because at the end of the day, those are kind of very individualistic points of view. So then, if you're not going to use morality, what standard are you going to use? And I think in the contemporary world, the only standard, what you might call a common, agreed-upon standard, the only standard that we can use in order to try to achieve a consensus on how to resolve the conflict is the law, in particular human rights law and international law. Now there's a group of people in this room who I suspect are thinking, well, the law is corrupt, the law is made by the rich to defend their rights, the law is made by the powerful to defend their power, to preserve their power. And of course, there is a large element of truth to that, but it's not a full picture, because number one, there are many aspects of the law, in my opinion, not the predominant aspects, but certainly significant aspects of the law, which are the result of very hard struggle by ordinary people at a great personal sacrifice to change the law. And they did manage, in many cases, to change the law, and they changed it for the better. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that even as there are many corrupt, depraved aspects of our domestic law, and also, of course, of international law, we shouldn't be oblivious to the fact that there are many things in the law which really aren't all that awful. The problem is not with the law. The problem is the implementation of the law. If you look at the issues that I mentioned briefly a few moments ago, on the question of borders, it's not awful for the Palestinians, it's not perfect, but it's not awful. The problem is Israel refuses to return to the 1967 borders, and nobody's forcing them to implement the law. On the question of the settlements, the law is completely on the side of the Palestinians. They're illegal under international law. If the law were implemented, the settlements would be gone. The problem is the implementation. Question of Jerusalem, it's not bad under international law. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. But Israel has annexed East Jerusalem. The U.S. has effectively recognized that annexation. The problem again is implementation. Under international law, Palestinian refugees have the right of return. Quite literally, not a single Palestinian has been able to exercise that right of return. The problem again is, usually with my students, I warn them at the first day of class that I have a phaser. And if I see somebody with a cell phone, my phaser is not set on stun. It's set on kill. So you would be wise to not bring the cell phone to class. In any event, as I was saying, the problem is, in part, the problem is the implementation. Now, some of you might be saying the law doesn't go far enough because in your moral calculus, the 67 borders are not sufficient. Palestinians should have the right to the whole of Palestine. And the only thing I could say to that is, of course, you're entitled to your own moral judgment and moral calculus. And nobody could say it's right and nobody can say it's wrong. But I don't think it's a basis for resolving the conflict. And I think that the only way to find some sort of resolution is to find a consensus on what constitutes a reasonable settlement under the current situation, and that to me is the international law with all of its defects and all of its limitations. It's interesting, just as a factual matter, and you'll forgive me if I'm digressing every once in a while, but as a factual matter, it's a very remarkable thing how rapidly our law has evolved. And I'm talking about here in the United States. So I do teach a course now on landmark Supreme Court decisions, and the whole face of America, the legal face of America, has just radically changed in my lifetime. Now, I'm not a spring chicken anymore, but I'm talking about literally in the last 30 years. Now, you're often told how backward those Muslim countries are, how backward those Arab countries are, and one of the proof positives of their backwardness is always the claim about the laws that illegalize homosexuality. Well, you'd be surprised to learn that in the landmark decision, the landmark decision in 1986, the Bowers versus Hardwick decision, Now, 1986, even for you people in the room, it would be roughly your parents' ages when they were in their 20s. In 1986, the United States Supreme Court illegalized homosexuality. When the case went to the court, it was declared illegal. It wasn't legalized until the Lawrence decision. The Lawrence decision comes in 2002. Now, the Lawrence decision, which legalized homosexuality, they were very careful to say, only in the privacy of your home. You can do the evil deed. We'll let you do it because it's a matter of privacy. But you can't do anything indicating your sexual preference in public or civil life. Well, people in this room are not too young to remember who made public display of and civil display of homosexuality illegal in the United States. You'd be surprised. It was Bill Clinton. In 1996, he passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which said marriage, there cannot be civil marriage between non-heterosexual people. Now, Clinton is considered a liberal, as is his wife. But they were the ones who ran on the illegalization of gay marriage. Now, some of you probably have already forgotten. In 1996, when Obama ran the first time for president, he ran on a platform opposed to gay marriage. He only changed his platform in 2000, when was the second election, 2004? Excuse me? 2012. Okay, Obama was 2002, and then 2012, and then 2000. He only changed his opinion because the people in Hollywood told him, you don't change your position on gay marriage, you're not getting our money. And the surprising thing was, Obama was just, he just calibrated everything to the polling numbers. And the American public, its attitude just changed so rapidly. When Obama ran the first time, 60% of Americans were against gay marriage. In his second term, it became 60% for, and he changed his view. But those are all very recent developments, and I think most people will agree those are aspects of the law which have changed our country for the better. And so we should always, I think, be a little cautious, a little careful before we're too dismissive of the law as being simply an instrument to oppress, an instrument of the powerful, an instrument of the rich. Yeah, there are a lot of aspects of the law that accurately describes, and I think you could say, by and large, it's an accurate description of the law. But there are aspects which are not all that awful, and the irony is that the law, as it's been interpreted in the last several decades, has been overwhelmingly favorable to the Palestinians. The problem has not been the law. The problem is the lack of implementation of the law. The last aspect of the conflict, which I think it's worth bearing in mind, is that all of the great changes in public opinion regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict, all of the great changes have been a result of the recurrent use of criminal force by Israel against the Palestinian people. When I first got involved in this topic in 1982, you really did take your life into your hands if you voiced support for the Palestinians. It was actually, not that I'm a hero, very, very far from it, especially when it comes to sheer physical courage. But it was a kind of a scary time. I remember a lot of the slogans back then were quite stupid, frankly. But we would go down 6th Avenue, the Avenue of the Americas, and we'd be chanting things like, "Everyone should know I support the PLO." PLO was the Palestine Liberation Organization, and it was sort of like the paradigmatic terrorist organization of its day. And I remember when I'm chanting, "Everybody should know I support the PLO." First of all, I thought it was a dumb slogan even back then. But leaving that aside, I was always waiting for somebody, on the 6th floor, like with JFK, to dispatch me to my maker prematurely. There was a button we used to wear in 1982. It was called "Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon." I belonged to a Jewish group that was opposed to what Israel was doing in Lebanon at the time. And I remember every morning I would have this intense dialogue with myself, whether I'm going to wear that button in the street. And part of me said, well, we don't have to wear it. And part of me felt, okay, it's the principal thing to do. But every time I would go on the subway platform, I was waiting for somebody to, push me onto the tracks. It was a very different climate. The climate, as everybody knows, has significantly shifted, not least and probably most saliently, most prominently among young American Jews. But each of the shifts that occurred on account of Israel's use of criminal force. So for those of you who are old-timers, so to speak, the first major shift occurs in public opinion in the United States. It occurs in June 1982 when Israel invades Lebanon. It was a very bloody invasion, actually much worse than any of Israel's recent massacres in Gaza. Between June 1982 and September 1982, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. And at that time, it was the first defection in public opinion. It was a fairly narrow strip. It consisted mostly of people of what were called the old left, and people identified with the old left. The names will mean nothing to most of the people in the room, but it was people like Pete Seeger, Paul Robeson Jr., folks like that who had been closely identified with Israel, because Israel at its founding appeared to be a kind of socialist leftist experiment with things like the kibbutzim, an austere style of living. The leadership was in what was called the Second International, the Socialist International. The main opposition party, called the Mapam, was very pro-Soviet Union, and so it seemed like it appeared to be having aspects of socialist and even communist orientation. And so it was not until pretty late in the day, until 1982, that the old left defected from the pro-Israel camp. The second big defection occurs in 1987 with what was called the First Intifada, the first nonviolent civil mass resistance to the Israeli occupation. I was teaching, I had just begun teaching then in 1988, and I remember one of my students, I remember it quite vividly. He was neither Jewish nor Arab Muslim. He was what's called, at least in New York, a white ethnic, meaning Irish or Italian. And at some point he raised his hand, because we were talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. He raised his hand and he said, Uzi, which was the best-known weapon of the Israelis, stone, he said, Uzi, stone, that's not fair. The stone was the chief, so to speak, weapon of the Palestinian children. And that marked a second defection, this time of many left liberals, like in places like back then they were important, they're not any longer, places like the Nation magazine. There was a third defection after the second Intifada began in 2001, and then the big defections beginning in 2007-8, when Israel was carrying on massacres of the civilian population in Gaza. The first major massacre occurs in 2007-8 during what was called Operation Cast Lead. And then there was a second massacre. This one was in 2014, Operation Protective Edge. Protective Edge was, by the standard of Israeli massacres in Gaza, it was by far the worst. During Operation Cast Lead, Israel killed about 350 children, destroyed about 6,000 homes. Operation Protective Edge, they killed 550 children, destroyed about 18,000 homes, and left behind a pretty shocking scene of death, destruction, murder, mayhem. Now, to give you some sense of the Israeli political spectrum as it's distilled in the United States, we were told during the past few weeks that Netanyahu was the bad guy. Fair enough. But the great hope was Benjamin Gantz, who they said presided over a center-left party. Now, Gantz, he lost, but Gantz was the chief of staff during Operation Protective Edge. He was the one who was responsible for all the death and destruction, or preeminently responsible. In fact, when Gantz ran against Netanyahu the past few weeks, and you should Google it, it's not without interest to just see it, his ads consisted of showing aerial from the sky, aerial scenes of having turned Gaza into a ghost town of rubble and destruction, and he was using that ad, the aerial footage, he was using that ad to promote his presidency. Now, I'm no great flag waver. I'm not what you would call a patriot by instinct or impulse. But I do have to say, I find it inconceivable that any American candidate, including Trump and people to the right of Trump, could possibly, in our culture, run for office with ads like that. That I find is just unimaginable. Now, yes, there's a lot of cheap, disgusting, wretched, racist, xenophobic rhetoric by our current president and the people that surround him, for sure. But that sort of ad, no. The Israeli spectrum is a very peculiar, not a very peculiar spectrum, but it's an unusual spectrum. Because the spectrum is not between, say, an alt-right and a left. In the United States, yes, we have a Trump, but we also have a Bernie Sanders. And there is a reasonable chance, no guarantee for sure, and still many hurdles to have to surmount, but there's a reasonable chance that the next president will be Bernie Sanders. But in the case of Israel, the spectrum goes from the far right to the very far right, from the alt-right to the super alt-right. There is no left. There's actually not even a moderate center in Israel. You want to tell me that Gantz is the center-left candidate? Well, you know, I won't say it's like Himmler being the center-left of Hitler's cabinet. I said I won't say that. And so, if there has been a dramatic shift in public opinion regarding Israel, and there clearly has, it hasn't yet registered politically in Washington, in Congress, but as a matter of public opinion, in particular in the Democratic Party, and in particular among Jewish youth. It has mostly, not entirely, but it's mostly been due to the incapacity of Jews in the United States and liberals any longer to reconcile their moral and political worldview with what Israel has become. I should also point out that even though the main factor over a sustained period has been Israel's recurrent resort to criminal force, the main factor right now has nothing to do with the Palestinians. The shift in the public opinion has occurred because American Jews who are overwhelmingly liberal, and liberals in general, the person they most loathe, it's no news to anybody in this room, is Donald Trump. But it also happens to be the case that Donald Trump's biggest cheerleader is Mr. Netanyahu. And liberals in general, and liberal Jews in particular, find that impossible to digest, impossible to assimilate. It's a big embarrassment that the leader of the Jewish state is so closely aligned with Donald Trump. And that in the short term, in the immediate term, has been the main factor why liberals in general and American Jews in particular have dissociated themselves from the state of Israel. And I don't see any real possibility that there will be any return, as a fancy Latin expression has it, to the status quo ante, namely, the romance between American Jews and Israel is over. I don't see any possibility whatsoever, unless Israel itself dramatically changes. I see no possibility that that romance will revive at some point in the future, because Israel has evolved into a lunatic state. It's a crazy state. People ask the question, why do they keep voting for Netanyahu? He now has an unprecedented 5 terms of office. And since the inception of his office, taking office, since its inception, he's always been surrounded by scandals. Either him or his wife, there's a scandal a day. And if you read the liberal press in Israel, they always say, it's over, we're the end of Netanyahu, he's finished. But like the old camp song, the cat keeps coming back. The cat came back, he wouldn't go away, the cat came back, he keeps coming back. So why, if this guy is always always surrounded by scandal, why does he come back? And the answer to me is perfectly obvious. Because Mr. Netanyahu is an obnoxious, loudmouth, racist, Jewish supremacist, xenophobe. And when the Israelis see him, they see themselves. So they keep voting for him because that's Israel. That's the face of Israel. There are marginal exceptions, but really, when you ask the marginal exceptions, they'll always say, we're marginal exceptions. This is the face of Israel. Now, some of you may say that's unfair, you shouldn't generalize, that's stereotyping. I don't see why that's unfair or stereotyping. If you were to say about the American South during the pre-civil rights era, if you were to say they were nasty, mean, racist people, it was a mean place. Nobody would take objection to that. I suspect even they would say, you know, there were a handful of liberals there, but it was a nasty place. South Africa was a very nasty place. Now, I'm the first one to acknowledge the American South in many ways has changed a lot. Just like our law has changed for the better, the American South has changed for the better. You talk to African American people nowadays, a lot of African American people, they retire and they go to the South. They say it's a much more civilized place. It's a very strange thing to hear from me speaking as a quote-unquote northerner, when I hear African Americans say, well, you know, South is much more civilized than the North. But yeah, it's changed, but back then it was a very nasty place. And the same thing is true of Israel. It's just a very ugly, nasty place. You know, you ask, oh, he gets involved in all these scandals because he takes bribes, and he's involved in this kind of chicanery and that kind of chicanery. Well, is that alien to the Israelis? They're stealing land, they're stealing Palestinian homes every day. Theft is a way of life. That's not a joke. I mean, that's, you know, you take people, you just throw them out of their houses. So you're shocked when they're not shocked at Mr. Netanyahu's relatively minor, incidentally, relatively minor threat and malfeasance. That's the whole society. And so the economy is booming. Foreign relations, it's true, it's never been better for Israel. Has allies in China, allies in Russia, allies in the Gulf states, Saudi, all openly now aligned with Israel. Even has allies now in places like Brazil. As the world has polarized, Israel has found many allies in Eastern Europe, the alt-right, and places like, as I said, as far afield as India under Modi, and Brazil under Bolsonaro. So he's been successful, and he's one of them. So of course they'll be voting for him. What do we are for time?
About 5 minutes.
There are many other things I wanted to talk about. Let me talk briefly about what's called the special relationship. The relationship between the U.S. and Israel. It comes up a lot now because of the courageous remarks of Ilhan Omar, the recently elected member of Congress from Minnesota. She is Somali. She was a genuine Somali refugee. As I understand it, she lived in a refugee camp for several years, 3 years, is that right? Yeah. So in many ways, she's a heroic figure. You know, all due honor, I have a lot of respect for John, what's his name, just from Georgia, John Lewis. Yeah, look, I don't like what he turned into, but in his youth, he was exceedingly courageous, principled, in many ways breathtaking. He turned into a hack, but that's what happens when you're in the Democratic Party too long. But if he was a hero, and he was a genuine hero, well, so is she. Surviving in Somalia, 3 years in the refugee camp, and she's made some recent remarks which have made waves, but interestingly enough, which is another indication of the very strange times in which we live. The New York Times coverage of her remarks has been overwhelmingly favorable. And she made some allegations about the Congress being essentially bought and paid for by the U.S. Congress. She didn't put it that way, but clearly that's what she was saying. And people were appalled, and other people were very glad she was finally saying something that everybody knew to be the case. So let me just say a few words about that Israel lobby, and then I'll end my remarks there. The Israel lobby, how it operates, is a very contentious issue in the United States. You would think there's an obvious explanation. Okay, there is the lobby, there is Congress, and how do they interact, and is it about money, what is it about? But the truth of the matter is, you can have many very well-informed people, and they reach different conclusions about how that Israel lobby works. My own view, for what it's worth, I have tried as much as I can to do my homework. My own view is as follows. The apologists for the state of Israel, they claim it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with shared interests and shared values. The Israel and the United States have shared values, Israel and the United States have shared interests, and that accounts for the close cooperation, the close collaboration between the United States and Israel. And the fact of the matter is, there is a significant amount of truth to that fact. There is a basic overlapping of interests on many different issues pertaining to the Middle East between the United States and Israel. The fact is, you don't see that overlapping interest in action because it's become so commonplace, so daily, so mundane, that it doesn't even appear on the radar screen. So there's the close military cooperation, there's the close intelligence cooperation, there's the close security cooperation. They're talking every day, really probably every minute of every day, quite literally, as they carry out, execute their joint interests in the current situation, trying to contain, as they call it, Iran and Iran's various allies. So there is a common interest, which I don't think one should lose sight of. And when there is a clash between U.S. national interests and Israeli national interests, when there's a clash, there isn't collaboration, but there's a conflict of interest, the lobby has next to zero power. It's reduced to a zero. So let's take an example most of you will remember because it's not so long ago. Let's take the case of Iran. When the United States, along with what were called, they were called the 5+1 powers, the 5 members of the Security Council in Germany, they reached a consensus we should cut a deal with Iran. Now, Israel was completely opposed to that deal. The Israel lobby, what's called AIPAC, the Israel lobby, it went into overdrive trying to stop that deal. What was its impact? Well, Charles Schumer from New York, he opposed the deal. Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, he opposed the deal. That was basically it. People like Dianne Feinstein, she's Jewish, very pro-Israel, but when it came to a U.S. national interest, and there was a consensus that a deal with Iran was a good thing, the Israel lobby couldn't do anything. However, when there are not critical U.S. interests at stake, for example, whether or not Israel annexes the occupied territories, the U.S. doesn't really care. If Israel were to say tomorrow, we're packing up our bags, we're removing all the settlements, and we're all going back to the 67 border, the U.S. would say, fine. Actually, it would probably be pleased by that fact. So, there's no major interest involved when it comes to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. And when there's no major U.S. interest, the lobbies are very powerful. Of course, they can determine U.S. policy when there's not a major interest, and they operate, though I would say at a higher level of efficiency and a higher level of money than, say, the NRA or the tobacco lobby or the big pharma lobby or the Cuba lobby. They're very efficient. The Israel lobby, they have lots and lots of money. They occupy strategic posts in places like the newspapers, publishing, areas like that. And when they make a concerted effort, yes, they can achieve big things. And there's no question in my mind, at any rate, that if Sheldon Adelson wields a lot of power in the Republican Party, it's not because of his good looks. And if Chaim Sabin wields a lot of power in the Democratic Party, it's not because of his scintillating conversation. It's because they are very rich and the campaign contributions count for a lot. Some of you may have seen the recent article in the New York Times on the lobby, and yes, it's true. They do worry about donors. Of course they worry about donors, elected officials. They spend probably, I hear statistics, they spend about a third of each day just trying to get money. And Jews are the wealthiest ethnic religious group in the United States. And they are by far the largest contributors to the Democratic Party. Republican Party, it's still not that significant. It's still much higher than the Democratic Party. So of course they're going to have influence. But I think one has to be careful about bending the stick too much in the other direction and forgetting the extent to which there is a fundamental overlapping of interests between the U.S. and Israel. The last thing, I'll just spend a couple of seconds on it. What is to be done? What could we do right now? Since May 30th of last year, the Palestinians in Gaza have been involved in nonviolent civil resistance, and a particularly heavy price. The human rights organizations are kind of like the law. There are good aspects of them, but there's also a lot of cowardice and hypocrisy in those organizations. So to take one example, the human rights organizations have, in the last 20, 30 years, they've been willing to criticize Israel for using what's called in international law disproportionate and indiscriminate force. That disproportionate force basically means taking a sledgehammer on a flea, that's disproportionate force, And indiscriminate force basically means somebody coming into this room and not liking the camera person here, and therefore coming with a machine gun and just spraying the whole room, hoping to hit him, making no effort to target the use of force. That's called indiscriminate force. And the human rights organizations have been pretty decent when it came to Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, or Operation Protective Edge. They were willing to argue, acknowledge that Israel used indiscriminate and disproportionate force. But there was one thing they wouldn't do. They wouldn't go the one further step and say that Israel was intentionally targeting civilians. And the reason why was perfectly obvious. I'm not going to give you now a long lecture on international law, but under international law, the three crimes of indiscriminate force, disproportionate force, and intentionally targeting civilians, they are of equal weight under international law. So if you're convicted, if you're accused of the crime of indiscriminate force, your crime is as weighty as if you're accused of intentionally targeting civilians. However, the public perception is very different. Most people think, well, indiscriminate force, disproportionate force, well, that's war. You know, war is all about indiscriminate, disproportionate force. The one thing the public will not accept is intentionally targeting civilians. And in the course of the demonstrations in Gaza, because they were overwhelmingly non-violent, and there was no excuse of the fog of war, and there were lots of video cameras focused on what was happening. For the first time, for the very first time, since the beginnings of the conflict coming under the scrutiny of human rights organizations, the last report from the Human Rights Council, which is a very large, very thorough, very authoritative, I disagree with them on, some points, but in general it was a very professional job. It runs to 220 pages. It was the first time that they said, quote, I'm getting as close as I can, I'll be paraphrasing, but we're pretty close. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting children. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting journalists. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting medical personnel. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting disabled people, people who are in their wheelchairs. Children, they're 300 yards away from what's called the fence. They're running in the opposite direction, and Israel shoots the kids in the head. Well, that's just a fact. Now, for anybody who's followed the conflict, as I have, of course Israel targets civilians, of course Israel targets children. There's just a voluminous amount of evidence. But it was the first time in an official report. Unfortunately, the international solidarity movement, Solidarity the Palestinians, of whom I suspect some are in this room today, they completely abandoned the people of Gaza. I had expected there would be a huge outpouring of support for the people of Gaza. There would be a real demonstration of solidarity up to and including civil disobedience. because the cause couldn't be more just. They're trying to end a brutal, illegal, inhuman, immoral blockade of Gaza. They want to breathe. A blockade that the UN Human Rights Chief called created a toxic slum in Gaza. A blockade that the former sociologist at Hebrew University, Baruch Kimmerly, called the biggest concentration camp ever. A blockade in which the people of Gaza, 97% of their drinking water is unfit for human consumption. As Sarah Roy of Harvard University, she put it, that the people are slowly being poisoned. And when we talk about the people, it's important to remember that of the 2 million people of Gaza, 1 million are children. They are younger than any person in this room. Those are the people who have been locked up, caged in, incarcerated into a toxic slum, a concentration camp. And now they're fighting for their lives. They want to break free of that illegal blockade. And regrettably, the international solidarity movement, despite repeated pleas from the people of Gaza for support, they've gotten as close to zero support as one could imagine. There's been like an occasional demonstration here or there. It's a miracle that it's lasted this long. The Montgomery bus boycott, when they tried to desegregate the buses, was an extremely heroic, courageous event. People forget it lasted a year. And that meant in the winter, the maids, the janitors, they had to get up like at 3 or 4 in the morning to trudge to work because they weren't taking those buses. And there wasn't yet Uber. But now, the people of Gaza, without in any way wanting to diminish the heroism, the courage, the pertinacity of the people of Montgomery, the people of Gaza are facing a rather more formidable foe, one which intentionally targets for murder. And that's a fact. Intentionally targets for murder children, medical personnel, journalists, disabled people. They've been at it now for more than a year. It started March 30th, so we're heading on to 1 year and 2 months. And there's no way on God's earth that they can succeed on their own, because Israel's just continued to mow them down until the people give up in despair. And it's been a real tragedy, I think, that there's been so little support shown for the people of Gaza. And somehow people think that whether or not Madonna performs in Tel Aviv is more important at this moment than showing solidarity with an active, massive, nonviolent civil resistance. I'm going to leave it there. There's one other aspect which I've been working on personally, having to do with the International Criminal Court. And if you're interested, I'll talk about that during questions and answers. But we'll leave it at that. Thank you.